evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us on the 2024-25 End of Year Pensions Process webinar, where we'll be dedicating the evening to discuss Type 2 self-assessment forms. My name is Debbie Roberts and I will be helping facilitate this evening's session. Okay, so just to let you know who we've got on the call this evening. So we have Katrina, who's the PCSE Senior Stakeholder Relationship Manager. We have Con from the PCSE GP Pensions team, and you've got myself and Kat from the PCSE Communications team. Okay, so just having a look at tonight's agenda, we'll be having a look at the end of year forms. We'll be discussing the employee contribution statement. We'll have a look at the Type 2 form in a bit more detail. We'll discuss calculating the correct tier rate, and then we'll have a look at what to do if there are any under or overpayments, and we'll also be answering your questions throughout the session. Okay, so we're going to start off by discussing what the Type 2 self-assessment form is and who needs to complete it. So I'm just going to quickly show you a quick video on that. Type 2 self-assessment forms are to be completed every year by Type 2 medical practitioners who are members of the NHS pension scheme. The 2024-25 Type 2 self-assessment form must be completed by Type 2 medical practitioners who are members of the NHS GP pension scheme between the 1st of April 2024 and the 31st of March 2025. So why do you need to complete a Type 2 self-assessment form? It ensures the correct tiered rate contributions have been applied to your salaried GP earnings. It ensures that the amount you are due to pay for your tiered rate and any added years or additional pension contributions has been identified, and shortfalls or refunds can then be dealt with by you and your employers. It also ensures that PCSE have the correct information about your total pensionable earnings, so they can ensure the correct amount is paid over by your employers. So who completes the Type 2 form? A salaried GP that's just been working in a practice will need to complete the Type 2 form. A salaried GP who's also been completing solo work will need to complete the Type 2 form. If you're a salaried GP and have been completing locum work, you'll need to complete the Type 2 form. And if you're a salaried GP that's been completing solo and locum work, you'll also complete the Type 2 form. GPs that have just completed solo work will also need to complete the Type 2 form, along with GPs that have completed both solo and locum work. Solely locum GPs should not complete a Type 2 form. Solo work might be work for an out-of-hours provider, a clinical lead, or a board member for an ICB, or alternatively, you may have been an appraiser for the NHS England region. Locum work will only be included if you have pensioned the work by submitting locum A and B forms within the required 10-week timeframe and have paid the relevant payments. As a locum GP, it's your decision whether you wish to pension your locum work. But remember, solely locum GPs should not complete a Type 2 form, as there is no requirement to do so. If a GP has changed roles throughout the pension year, for example, being a partner GP, then moved to a salaried position, then you'll need to complete both the Type 1 and Type 2 forms in order to cover both roles. You must only include practitioner income on your Type 2 form. If you had an officer role, this will have been pensioned directly by your employer and must not be included on your Type 2 form. If you are unsure if your work is classed as practitioner or officer in the pension scheme, the provider you work at should be able to advise you. Work carried out for an independent provider employing authority cannot be pensioned as practitioner. Further guidance about what pay is actually pensionable is available on the NHS Pensions and BMA website. Okay, so I hope you found that video useful. Now I'm going to hand you over to Katrina, that's going to run through some key points that are good for you to remember.
Thank you, Debbie. Good evening, everyone. We're starting with the key points because we've already run a couple of webinars on the Type 2 forms for 24-25 because they've been available to complete since October last year. So we've kind of taken a few of the things that have been really commonly asked questions on those webinars, just to summarise up front, to try and help you, so that you don't have to perhaps ask as many questions, and then you can focus in on the things that you do need to understand more about. And then we'll get on shortly after that to showing the PCSE Online Type 2 form as a live completion in the test environment. So some of the key things then, just to reiterate the submission deadline. So the deadline is set by NHS Pensions and it's the 28th of February. We've popped on here, people ask what's the difference between completing the form on PCSE Online and doing it what you might call the old-fashioned way of going to the NHS Pensions website, downloading the form, filling it all in, and then going to the Contact Us form on the PCSE website, uploading it, getting a case reference, and then waiting on that coming through and being processed. So if you use PCSE Online, then you've got all of the information there when you log in, so you don't need to complete all your own details, name, etc., GMC numbers, and a lot of the data is also populated for you. So it's quicker, and it's you go to one place to complete it. You're not then going to have to go to somewhere else to submit it. So it is quicker and easier to use PCSE Online, which is why we are holding these webinars to help people navigate the system if you're not used to doing that. We also get asked a lot about where can I find my total pensionable pay. You'll hear me talk about total pensionable pay when we go to filling out the forms. So if you're a Type 2 GP who does some locum work as part of your portfolio of work, then that will be the total of the pensionable pay from all of your locum B forms for your locum pensionable pay. But for your other roles as a salaried GP, or if you have any other roles that are pensioned through PCSE, then the easiest place to find your total pensionable pay is from your month 12 payslip, the total for the year, really. So that's, as I say, a common question. One of the other things that we get asked a lot about, especially if people have changed practice or moved to a practice for the first time during this pension year or just shortly before this pension year, that they're now filling the Type 2 form in for. So if you changed roles during 24-25 or perhaps just a bit before that, you need, and you go to the Type 2 form in PCSE Online and you're not seeing the practice that you were working at and maybe still do work at in 24-25 there for selection. And if you go to your employee contribution statement on PCSE Online and you don't see contributions for the particular practice for the year, then what that means is that no pension contributions have been deducted from the practice for you. You might very well and probably will have had them deducted from your salary, but it means that no pensions joiner has been completed, and you have to kind of take that back to the first step in that process, which is where you yourself as a Type 2 GP completes an employment change on PCSE Online in the performer record section of PCSE Online. So you have to kind of take yourself back to check and remember, did I do that? Did I complete the the employment change to say I started at the practice on a certain date? If I did that, then actually go back in and check, was that approved? You're a salaried GP, so it just needs to be approved by the practice. But if it hasn't been approved, that step needs to be completed. And when that approval is there, so if you can see that it's not approved, nudge the practice to approve it, and then they need to submit the pensions joiner. If you can see that it has been approved, then again, nudge the practice, speak to the practice manager, because they need to complete the pensions joiner to make sure the pension contributions are initiated for you, as that you're getting pension contributions deducted from that practice. That will then resolve things for going forwards, and it will also mean that PCSE are able to process your Type 2 form. You'll then be able to go in and complete it, because the practice will then be available for selection, and PCSE will then be able to process it for you. So just to recap on that, if you go to complete your Type 2 form and you've been a salaried GP and the practice isn't there for selection, or even before that, go to the employee contribution statement, and if you see that there are no monthly salary contributions showing on your contribution statement for the practice in question, go to your performer record in PCSE Online. Have you completed the employment change to say you started at the practice? If not, you need to do that. If you have done that and it's still waiting approval from the practice, nudge them to approve it and then remind them they need to immediately do the pensions joiner. Then after that, you'll be able to do your Type 2 form. If you can see that you've already done that employment change on your PCSE performer record and the practice have approved it, so it's showing there is approved on your record, then you speak to the practice manager to explain that you can see that there are no contributions deducted on your, or showing on your employee contribution statement for the practice, and that means they need to complete that pensions joiner. It's a very quick and easy thing for the practice to do. There's about 3 or 4 fields on a basic form on PCSE Online for them to complete, so it should only take them a few minutes. And after they've done that, then you'll be able to go back into PCSE Online to the Type 2 area and complete the form. So a lot of detail there, but that area is probably, certainly for salary GPs, people find challenges when they go in to try and do the form, try to complete the form. So that's that bit, and we can come back to any more detailed questions that people have got later on. And then I guess the final bits are just about some of the guidance that we've got. We get asked a lot about, what help there is available, and Debbie will cover that later on. So I think we will get straight into looking at the Type 2 forms. So we have a test GP that we've logged into PCSE Online. Go to the PCSE Online homepage, put our username and password in, and we've just got this, a test GP, so they've just got the pensions tile here, but you'll have your performer tile. Actually, if I go back, this one has been set up fully, so they've got the performer tile and they've got pensions and payments. So we're going to click on to get to the pensions area. We go to the pensions area. So we'll go to the Type 2 form in just a moment, but just to recap on this all important employee contribution statement button that you've got access to. So when you click on that, then as you'll see, all of the screens really, when you're logged in with your credentials as a GP, then all of the screens will auto-populate with your details. So this is our dummy GMC number, NI number, pension scheme membership number, and name of our test GP. So when we scroll down, we can see that, excuse me, we've got the financial years available for selection. So we've got 24-25, which is the year we're interested in for the purposes of the Type 2. So we're just going to have a quick look at that. And then what you can do is you can just immediately go to click search, and that will return all of the contributions that PCSE have got on record for you for 24-25. So you can see that our GP here, and it is it's a test data that's been set up, but our GP's got monthly salary, so from a salaried role in a practice, so monthly salary contributions. And for people that aren't familiar with employee contribution statements, you have your different income type depending on the role, the month that the contributions have been applied to, the monthly pensionable pay for that particular role, the employer contributions that have been deducted or paid, and the employee contributions that have been deducted or paid. And if there have been any AVC, so if you've had an added years contract or another type of AVC, then any contributions collected or deducted in relation to that will show in this column. We'll get onto the Type 2 form in a moment, and we'll see that that splits out a little bit, but it shows as a single column on the employee contribution statement. And if you scroll down to the very bottom, depending on how many different roles you've got, you get there eventually, and you'll see your totals. So total pensionable pay that we've got on record, total contributions, etc. And you can download this. You can download it as a PDF if you just like to keep the view of it, or you can also download it as a CSV. So if you want to filter and check any of your totals for different roles, etc., then it's very easy to do that. But you can also filter it on the type of income here from the top of the screen. So if we just click monthly salary here and then click search again, then we can see that it just filters down to all of our monthly salary contributions, and we can look specifically at that role if we want to go through all of our roles separately when we're preparing to complete the Type 2 form. The other thing that you will see is that if some GPs work part-time at 2 different practices. So if you select monthly salary, you might still have 2 lines for April, 2 lines for May, 2 lines for June, and you might want to look at them separately. In that instance, you'd go to select practices and you'd have one practice is the test practice there as a GP surgery, and the other is, we'll get onto the solo role for the ICB in a moment, but if our GP worked part-time at 2 different practices, then they would have 2 different options, and you can filter on just that practice, go to click search again, and it would filter down to the contributions there. So do have a play around with the employee contribution statements if you've not been used to looking at that. It's very useful. It's very helpful for you to be able to see before you start going to the Type 2 screen, and just check that everything looks as you're expecting. So when I mentioned earlier in those frequently asked questions about a GP going to this employee contribution statement, and just let's say me as the test GP works at 2 practices and I've only got contributions for 1, then this is when I'm going back to, right, hang on, is my employment change, have I actually completed it to say I started at that other practice? Have I, has it been approved? And then speaking to the practices, as I mentioned. So that's just a very quick recap on the employee contribution statement. But whilst you're in the pensions area, and the main purpose of the webinar this evening is for us to look at the self-assessment Type 2. So if we click on that, you'll see there are 2 buttons. Then self-assessment is where we're going to go to complete the form, and then this listing screen is where you go to find or where you will see all of the approved forms that PCSE have on record for you since 2015-16, and that's when the data goes back to that was migrated from the old system that predates PCSE. So and then forms that have been submitted and completed after the PCSE online system went live. So you will see forms that have been completed and approved. You will see forms that you've submitted recently via PCSE online that might say have a status of declarated. That means that you've submitted it, but it's waiting on PCSE processing and hopefully approving it. You'll see if there have been any PCSE online submissions that have been rejected, and you'll also see anything that's in draft. So when we go to start this self-assessment, and I'll show you once we've completed it, the listing screen, but if we go to start, so first of all, just to point out again, all of these details have auto-populated, so I don't need to sit and complete all of that on the Excel form if I was downloading it from NHS Pensions. I then get to select the financial year, so 24-25 there you can see is red, and that means it's available for me to select. If it says anything beside it and the numbers are grey instead of red, and it says something like initiated or completed or anything like that, then you would go straight to the listing screen, because as soon as you even complete the first section and save a form, or even if you go out and it has saved, then it go out of the system and it's saved, partially completed, even if it's very little detail, it then becomes a draft. And the draft is accessible by going to the listing screen. The draft, if you have any sort of draft, this won't be read and it won't let you select it. So if you see that it's grey and you think, hang on, I've not submitted my form, I've not done that yet, then go to the listing screen, you find it in the drafts, and you'll be able to just click on it and continue on and get all of the right information onto it. So, but very simply for us, all we need to do is select 24-25. And when we select that, you can see that our practice that we worked at as a salaried GP has auto-populated here. If it hasn't, then you can enter the practice code, practice name, to search for that. But if the practice is showing on your employee contribution statement, then the majority of the time it will auto-populate here. So again, you don't have to fill out the practice details. You don't expect to see the practices you locumed at, and if you do for any reason decide to fill in the paper version of the form, you don't add them to the boxes that say declare the organisations you worked for. It doesn't include locum, and your details will auto-populate, as I say, on the PCSE online version. So there's a couple of questions that we come to next. So the next question is, where you on maternity, paternity, adoption, or sick leave. So that's eliciting whether you have had a period of authorised leave. So if we say no to that, because in this instance we haven't, but if we were to say yes, then what it would do is just populate the tick in here to say we need to complete the authorised leave tab, and when we move through the form, the authorised leave tab would be there for us to complete. However, if we say no, then obviously it's not expecting us to complete the authorised leave tab, and it won't be presented to us on our form. Again, the paper form has all the pages regardless of your circumstances, so this is really just to help you, get through the exercise quicker and easier. And then there's a question that's been introduced by NHS Pensions. It's not been a long-standing question, but that question's been on the form now, and it's asking if you had an added years contract during 24-25, and this in PCSE Online, then the form is linking back to the data that we hold for you. So if we are checking back to the data, so if I was to tick no to this, then it tells me that actually I need to select the correct option. So if I thought my added years contract had ended, I had asked for it to be ended to NHS Pensions or whatever, and maybe the information hasn't filtered through to PCSE, then I need to submit a query to PCSE to get that looked at before I would complete the form. But I know that in this instance, the test GP has or had an active added years contract in the year 24-25. It was 3%, and it actually auto displays on this page for you what it was. So that's the percentage that's going to be taken into account when we go to complete the form. So again, it does it all for you. So straightforward. So all we need to do then is save and next. So we've clicked on there, and it's going to take us to this next page. So what I've done there in haste is just jump up to the top. So we can see that we've got very little in the way of tabs to fill in here. So we've got the details page now that we're going to complete our income and so on. 24-25 form, and it's a full year. There's nothing horrible like the split year we had in 22-23. So it's a single page, and everybody has been in the 2015 scheme since, get this right, April 22. So there is no longer, like the older versions of the form, there was a different section for 2015 or the older scheme. So form on PCSE Online is now simplified. So what we're looking at then is, if we think about that employee contribution statement that we had a brief look at, we could see that our GP had a salaried role in a practice. We could see that they had a little bit of solo work and some locum work, again, just test example. So if we scroll down here, what we'll see is we've got row 2 because we've got a salaried role. So if we only had solo work, row 2 wouldn't be there, it would just be populating from row 3. But we've got row 2 for this salaried role at this practice, and then we have got to look at the solo part of the form. So we've had a solo post, so we've got some income populating into the row 3 for the solo, and then we've also got row 5, which is the locum row. So we'll go through each of them, but before we do that, just checking on what row 6 is telling us importantly. So that in box 6, this is the total of all of the practitioner pensionable pay that the test GP has had. So at the moment, what's sitting as a figure as the salaried role is the estimated income. So we'll think about whether that's the correct income that we actually earned for the year. But based on that estimated income and then what the GP's earned for their solo role and their locum role, it takes it to 55,900. And so what we then need to do is confirm what the actual pensionable pay was for the roles, and then the total that we get in box 6, this is what we use to check the tier rate table to confirm the correct tier rate that we should have been paying contributions at, that contributions should have been deducted and paid over for us. Act, for the GP Act. So we need to make sure that we look at that tier rate table once we've confirmed what this total income is. So let's just take a look through each of the rows. And we come back to select the tier rates from the drop down of options once we've confirmed that pensionable pay. So we've got the salaried row. So the figure that populates in box 2 is the estimated annual income figure that was submitted by the practice on the practice estimate for 24-25. And the figure that populates in box 2C is the amount of employee contributions that the PCSE system has deducted from the practice for our GP based on this estimated income and the tier rate they said at the time they thought the GP would be on. But remember, that's all an estimate. So what we then need to do is look at the month 12 payslip and say, right, okay, it wasn't 50,000 straight. It was, it became, let's say it was 600, something like that, whatever we want to enter. So we're going to enter the correct actual earnings in box 2 for our salaried row. The purpose of the self-assessment form is twofold. So it's to help you as a GP check whether you have actually paid the correct contributions or whether the practice has actually deducted the correct contributions from you. It's a self-assessment. And then by submitting it to and you then sort that out with the practice. By submitting it to PCSE can then look at your actual earnings and say, well, we're calculating in the system, as what's been deducted from the practice, does that turn out to be correct? Or do we need to apply an adjustment to take additional contributions or refund contributions to the practice because the estimate was either a bit over or a bit under? So when we've entered that actual practitioner pay, the other thing that we're then going to do is say, well, what did I have deducted from the practice in terms of employee contributions? So it may be that, through the payroll system and however that was configured for me, maybe it was a little bit late at catching up with my tier rate or whatever. And that might be that there was £3,000, let's just say as an example, deducted. And we'll come back to box 2B in a second once we've selected the correct tier rate. So that's what I've completed there, my actual pensionable pay from my month 12 payslip and what I've actually had deducted from me for employee contributions, again from a month 12 payslip. Box 2C has populated with what PCSE have taken from the practice through the monthly contractual statements for me. So getting on to the solo row, then we've got solo income of £2,900 and we've got employee contributions that have been paid over by that employer of £310.30. So that should match my annual solo form. This has come from the PCSE system, and as long as that is the amount of solo earnings that I can see on my annual solo form, then I'm happy with that. So that should be exactly the same. The solo contributions get to the system through data that's submitted or uploaded by the ICBs, either for clinical leads or board members that work for them, or for out-of-hours providers, GPs that work for out-of-hours providers in their area. So that data is uploaded now directly to the PCSE system. So that should exactly match your annual solo form. So you shouldn't see any difference there in terms of this is what I earned and this is what was actually paid in employee contributions. And then if we get onto the locum income, then we, again, on a monthly basis, everybody who does locum work knows acutely about the 10-week rule. So I've only got 10 weeks at the end of the period of work to get locum A forms completed, then get them approved by the practice or the appraisal team, it'll be practice actually. And then I would when I've had my A forms approved, then I'd complete my B form. If I've decided to and I would only do all this if I've decided to pension that locum income. So by doing that and getting them submitted to PCSE on time within the 10 weeks with my payments, I will have been able to see during the year of 24-25 sort of gradually my employee contribution statement populating with all of that locum work. So when I get to the end of the year, I can see that £3,000 is exactly what I've paid as locum. Check my own records. £156 is exactly what I've paid in employee contributions. So that's what I'm expecting to see, and then we get on to our totals. So what we need to do, just to recap then, we're saying that actually the GP's total pensionable pay across and as you know, as the total for all of the roles is now sitting at 55,500. And if I'm looking at the tier rate table correctly, then that should be a tier rate of 10.7%. So I've actually used different figures when I tested this out earlier, so hopefully I'm still in the same bracket. So if it is 10.7% tier rate, then what you will see happen is we're saying, right, okay, we've got the figures that have been populated in the difference box is what I need to calculate with the practice and resolve with them. If I go to the no, that hasn't. Yeah, okay. So 10.7% of £3,000 as the solo example is going to be over £300, and I've only paid £156. So what this means is that when the solo provider has been deducting my pension contributions, it looks like it's only been deducted at this sort of 5.6% rate, or one of the really low rates, and that's a genuine example that can happen. Same with the income that's been paid by the role that I've got for the practice. If I've been on a lower tier rate, or they've been paying contributions for me at a lower tier rate, then when it comes to the end of the year, then there is a shortfall to reconcile. So the true figure that is owed for me, if it's 10.7% of 49,600, is this kind of 5,307.20. 3,000, I'm saying if I only had 3,000 deducted from me by the practice, then I'm going to end up with having a shortfall to sort out with them. However, a more realistic example is probably that I've had something like 5,000 deducted, and I might find that I've got to say to the practice, right, you've not quite, my type 2 form shows that I've not quite had the right amount deducted from you. It's calculating that I owe you, or I owe £307.20. So that gets sorted out between yourself and the practice, and you can show them that type 2 form to explain that. But this other figure in box 2C is where we've got the figure for that PCSE have already collected from the practice, and what you'll see then is that PCSE's system will then calculate and deduct from the practice the difference that they owe, because if they genuinely only have had 3,249.96 deducted, then they have got the difference between the 5,307.20 and this still to pay. So that's collected as an automated adjustment from them. You don't, as a GP, you don't need to worry about that, but it's just to explain why that figure is there. And the process that happens thereafter, because we always encourage GPs to let the practice manager know when you've submitted your type 2 form, because they then can be minded that if there has been either an underestimate of income, or if the contributions have been deducted at what turns out to be too low a tier rate, there's going to be an adjustment that they'll see in the coming months. Once your form's been reconciled by PCSE, there'll be an adjustment on the practice statement to collect the difference. And equally, if it turned out that you'd had too much deducted, they had set it at too high a tier rate and too much have been deducted, then they can expect a refund. So that's just to give them a heads up. But for your own purposes, whatever you can see on your month 12 statement, compared to what the system calculates should have been the total of employee contributions that you've paid. If there's a figure in box 2B, then that's telling you that you've either got a shortfall in this instance to sort out with the practice. They may take that through payroll, or they'll agree with you how they do that. That's completely outside of PCSE. Or it could be the other way around, that it actually shows that you've paid a bit too much and they've got to offset that for you going forwards. So that's the practice side. If we go back to the solo, then if we look at our solo provider, then actually the £310.30 that was deducted there is correct. They have been deducting at 10.7%. So they've got it right, and there's nothing for them to sort out, nothing for you to sort out with them. So that's straightforward. If the tier rate they've been deducting at was too low, then there'd be a difference value here. And we'll recap on shortfalls and overpayments in a moment. But essentially, from a solo role, if it's an ICB, then PCSE would contact the ICB to notify them, and then they would resolve that with you. Then finally, your locum work. So for whatever reason, when our test GP has been submitting their locum A&B forms, they've selected, I think, probably the 5.6% tier rates here, when it turns out that when they take all of their income for the year into account, they should have been on 10.7%. So this is saying the GP themselves has already paid £156. That's what their employee contribution statement shows as employee contributions for their locum earnings. So they've paid that already. During the pension year, now that the reconciliation has been done, that's showing that they need to pay another £165. And that means that they need to make a shortfall payment, complete a shortfall template to explain what that payment is relating to, and then we will be able to get the record reconciled. So an adjustment is when the shortfall payment is received, an adjustment is processed by PCSE. So the GP would then be able to go back to their employee contribution statement and show this. Once they've paid the 165, they'll be able to see that the 165 is then showing on their employee contribution statement once it's been processed, and then PCSE can then get the record finalised and go and get the pension record updated on the NHS pension system. But you can see in this example that when a GP's got a different portfolio of different roles, then you've got to kind of go through each one and work it through. I think in some of the earlier webinars we've concentrated, one was on salary GPs, and I think the other one we focused a bit more on GPs that do solo work. So this is a bit more of a mixed bag, lots of different things going on. So each one needs to go through and check. So what we can see in the totals row then, just to go over that, row 6 is the totals of our pensionable pay for all of the different roles, total of the contributions paid, and showing currently what's an underpayment. But like I say, the solo and the locum needs to be resolved before we can process the form and finalise the form on the system. Then just a quick kind of touch on the added years. So if you remember at the beginning of this type 2 form, we saw that this GP has a 3% added years contract. That means they need to pay 3% of their 55,500 total income. And we then say, okay, the GP can fill in here, what have I actually had deducted for added years for me, through payroll again. So I'm going to my pay slips. Box 8C is populating with what PCSE have deducted from the practice. So the 3%, if we say, right, okay, actually it should be 1665, then we will see that as a GP, I can see that I paid the correct amount. PCSE will process this, and there's a small adjustment to go back to the practice in this instance. So again, it's just looking at letting you check for yourself whether or not you've actually paid the correct or had the correct amount deducted. PCSE will sort out any difference with the practice and any of the providers that you have worked for. There is on the PCSE online version box 7A that populates with the employer contributions that have been paid and again deducted for your roles. You don't have to worry about that because PCSE will reconcile on that. But and box 7 is where a GP has an additional voluntary contributions contract, so not added years, but an AVC's contract, and that would populate if I had any separate AVC contributions. But in this instance, we've got our added years contract, we've got our 3 types of employment, we've been through and completed everything we need to complete, and there's just some summary boxes that appear on kind of final rows on the PCSE online version. So these are additional to what you'll see on the paper form, but they're all auto-populated and not something that you need to get too worried about. But what would really happen with this form, if we just scroll back up, you think about the fact that I've said PCSE need to make sure that the solo and the locum work is fully reconciled before they can finalise it and submit it through the system to take any adjustment due from the practice for your salaried role. So we've already said we're absolutely spot on with the solo contributions. I've said PCSE would contact our GP if they've not already paid the shortfall when we start processing this. So, and we're actually saying that once they've paid that shortfall, then that would be adding to their record on PCSE. So we would be reconciling that, and what would really be happening then is that when PCSE go to submit this, then I think if I've done the sums right, it actually means that, yeah, with the shortfall payment having been made for the locum work on top of what was originally paid for employee contributions, that would come to £321, and then that comes to absolutely zero. So, but ultimately, from my point of view as the GP, it might be that when I'm completing this type 2 form, I may have already only paid or had deducted rather this 165. If that's correct, then I'm going to just click submit or save and next, sorry, and then that will take me to the final declaration. It has come through, so this takes me on to the final page, which is the full declaration that you'll find on the type 2 form. So I need to just check on all of that. Tick to confirm. It will populate with today's date, so that's the equivalent of me signing it. And then all I need to do is click submit. Obviously, it might be a good idea to go back over and check that I've got all my figures correct first of all. But if I just click submit on here, that will then land immediately in the PCSE system, and we'll go back and find it in the listing screen. I appreciate that did go into quite a lot of detail because of that portfolio and kind of trying to explain how all of the different bits work. As you're going through to complete it, as long as you've got all of your information in front of you, it actually only takes minutes to do it. It doesn't take a long time at all. Oh, there we go. So what you'll see then is that's submitted. It now just says you've got the print button, so you've got an option to print it should you wish, but you know, carbon neutral and all of that stuff, good stuff, so you can go anytime. You don't need to print it. You will never need or should never need a copy of it for anything. If you did, you could print it in the future, but you know that at any time you want to, you go back to the GP pensions area, go to self-assessment type 2, instead of clicking the self-assessment button, click the listing button, and I'm just going to click search on here. If you don't need to put the dates in, you can do if you wish to. So I've just clicked search, and that's brought up this one form that I've just submitted. It's got a status of declarated, and that means that the GP has completed the declaration, but PCSE have now to review and process the form. And what you will be able to do is you can click on the hyperlink here and open that form back up. If the form does happen to have to be rejected by PCSE for any reason. Hopefully it shouldn't. You've got all of the information in front of you. But if it does, then you would see when you go to the listing screen here that it would show as rejected. You would just scroll along. You can now see some extra columns, and you'd have a little symbol here that allows you to revert it to draft. So you revert it to draft, which then creates a second version of your form, and that then allows you to do any corrections and do a resubmit. So that's quite straightforward to do. If you have submitted a form, it's all going through beautifully and it's been approved, but 6 months down the line or 6 weeks down the line, some new information's come to light that some of the figures you had provided were incorrect. You would be able to, you'll have an option for any of the approved forms, you'll have an option to resubmit. So you can click on that, there'll be a resubmit option, it comes up at the end, and you click on that and again, fill in the revised figures, click submit to send that through, and that goes through the same cycle and process. And probably the final thing to just show you whilst we're still in here is from a self-assessment point of view. If I go now and go back to that page again, so it's still populated with all my details. It doesn't know yet which form I'm trying to fill out. And I'm going to go here and you can see that it says already initiated, completed. It will show that message or a similar message even if it's just a draft. So even if it hasn't been submitted through to PCSE. So if you see this greyed out bit, all you need to do is go back to that listing screen and you'll find your form, continue from there. And the other thing, sorry, I did say it was the final thing, but one more final thing is when you go to this list, we also get people who are worried about if they see older years, that they might see 21, 22 showing as red, and they know that they can go to the listing screen and that shows as approved. That actually happens. It's still available for selection on this screen if I didn't submit it on PCSE Online. So if I've submitted a paper form for some of the older years and PCSE have processed that and it's showing as approved on my listing screen, I don't need to worry about it. It's approved and I can forget all about it. But it would still show, so let's just say that was 21, 22. 21, 22 would still show as an option in red. And some people get a little bit panicked by that, thinking, does that mean that PCSE haven't, what's wrong here? There's something wrong with the system. It only goes grey like this for the ones that are the years that are submitted or have been submitted online. So if you've submitted the paper form through Contact Us, go to your listing screen. If it's showing there as approved, it means that PCSE have done all the manual processing and the manual keying, and that's it, it's done. You don't need to worry about it at all, but it's just to mention that. So I'm going to stop sharing there for a minute. I thought it might be a good idea to maybe pause and see if we've got questions about completing the form. So there's one kind of technical one about added years. So box 8C, we're asking specifically about, talking about added years, and the question is, if box 8C has not been populated, does that mean my employer hasn't paid the contributions? So box 8C is the box that I said was auto-populated with the figures that PCSE have on record that have been, if you've got a practice role, that have been deducted from the practice. So if it's a practice role, it'll be deducted from the practice. So row 2 and box 2C are about the employee contributions, and row 8, box 8C, is about the added years. So yes, that's something you need to take up with the practice, and probably needs a query to PCSE then to get that resolved for you, if that is a real scenario. So we've got a question about, I have only worked as a salaried GP. Do I need to complete the form? So you do. The video, I mean, you may have joined a little bit late, but the video at the beginning goes through all of the different combinations of roles that people have where a type 2 form is required, and working as a salaried GP trumps everything else. So you need to always have a type 2 form completed, and that's the only exception to that would be if the practice you work for is an independent provider employing authority in the NHS pension scheme, so they will not be pensioning you through the practitioner scheme, but they should be talking to you about that, so you should be well aware of that. You won't have anything on an employee contribution statement in PCSE Online if that's the case. But there's a secondary bit to this question saying my work as a locum was via a limited company, so not pensionable. I've received an email, does this mean I need to complete the form? So if your locum work wasn't pensionable, you wouldn't include the locum work in the Type 2 form. You wouldn't, it won't be showing on the PCSE system, but your salaried role means that you do need to complete this Type 2 form. When's month 12 payslip? Is this the end of March? Yes, sorry, Francis, it is. In the pension year runs from April to March. It's nearly the same as the tax year. The tax year also runs April to March, but your payslips, month 1 is April and month 12 is March. Are bonus payments pensionable? I'm going to not put Janet on the spot, but refer to her offline on that. I think the answer to that is it depends on what your contract is, what is pensionable. So we'll see if we can get an answer on that. It may be something that you need to confirm with NHS Pensions and sometimes on a case-to-case basis. So the question about covering authorised leave, so we will touch on that. We're also trying to get a specific guide, Sarah, published for authorised leave. So if you bear with us on that as well, and the intention is that we'll do a little video. We certainly are looking to publish a specific guide on the impacts on the Type 2 form. So we'll try and cover it a little bit tonight, but if we don't get time, then you can look out for that in the coming weeks, certainly, and before the 28th of February deadline. The question here about is 23-24 form missing due to different submission option last year. Then, so Type 2, it's absolutely right to say the forms weren't available on PCSE Online at this time last year, so they weren't available in time for the 28th of February cut-off, but they were made available towards the end of May, early June. So if you didn't do your 23-24 form at all last year, you can now do it on PCSE Online. So it'll be available for selection. If you did do it on paper and submit it through Contact Us, which was the guidance at this time last year, then if you go to your listing screen, you should see that as approved, or you'll have had an email from PCSE if there's been any query about the form. Okay, so tier rate then. We've got the 24-25 tier rate table here. We've touched on it's based on the total of your pensionable pay, but what I didn't mention when we were in the detail of completing the certificate is if you have started practitioner work partway through the pension year, or you finished practitioner work and moved on to do something else partway through the pension year, so you've not had continuous practitioner employment, then you need to annualise your income. So let's just say, for example, so I think this example says the GP had, so this is a 23-24 example, but the same principle applies. You'll find on, if you do need to annualise your income according to the pension rules, you'll see that on the NHS Pensions website, there's a different annualisation calculator for each year, taking into account the different tier rates, etc. But the principles of how you fill it in are the same for 24-25 as they were for 23-24. So in this 23-24 example, what we were saying is the GP had a Type 2 post from the 1st of July 23 to 28th of February 24. And the most common reason for this is probably that they might have been a GP registrar before that. Until then, GP registrar posts are treated as officer posts in the NHS pension scheme, which means the contributions are paid over directly through payroll. I guess they don't come through the PCSE system, so you would not see GP registrar contributions on your employee contribution statement in PCSE Online, but you would see your NHS pensions record when it's updated for the particular pension year. But coming back to, okay, became salaried in a practice from the 1st of July 23, that means that the GP didn't have a continuous practitioner post for the whole of the 23-24 year. So it's quite a simple example, but they go to the calculator, you have to select the income type, and the income type for the calculator's purposes is either Type 2 or locum. Type 2 is if it's salaried or if there's solo work. You would select Type 2 for either of those. You put the start date of the role, so 1st of July 23, end date of the role, 28th of February 24. They moved on to do something else after that, so they weren't even there until the end of March. What the pensionable pay was for that period, so what did the GP actually earn for that period, and then we just simply click calculate, which is near the top right there. And when we click calculate, then this NHS pensions tool calculates what the annualised pay would be. So what would I have earned if I had been, or what would our GP have earned if they had been working the full 12 months at this rate of pay? So that comes out at 63,837. And according to the tier rate table for that year, that puts them on 12.5%. So 63,837 versus the actual earnings of 42,500. If we go back one slide, Debbie, if that's possible, please. 42,500 would have come into the 9.8% bracket, but when we've annualised, then that's taken us into the 12.5% bracket. So you only need to think about annualisation if you have not had a continuous employment. Now, that is another example would be this GP might have worked as a salaried GP during that period, but perhaps in the earlier months, and even again in March, they might have done some locum work. So what they need to do in that instance is they need to start adding. So you can see there's a box in the calculator that says add row, and they add each locum period of work. So what the pensionable pay was for the period, the start and end date of the period, according to the locum form, and they need to go through and keep adding all of those periods to then calculate the annualised pensionable income, and that's what you then use to say look up the tier rate table to get the tier rate. You're still only paying contributions on your actual earnings, but you can see that you're paying at a higher tier rate, and that's just due to the annualisation rules that apply to the NHS pension scheme. One thing to point out is that the top tier rate band now is on about 60 something thousand, I think. So if you look, and even if you didn't have continuous pensionable pay for the whole year, if your total already takes you above that threshold and you know that you're on the highest tier rate anyway, you can't go any higher than that. So you don't need to fill the calculator out to work out that you should be on 12.5%. So only fill that out if you're coming in under the top tier rate threshold, and then that will calculate the true tier rate that you need to apply for you. So let's move on, Debbie, just to a couple of other quick points on under and overpayments before we go back to questions then. So we've talked about the monthly salary roles that GPs have and how the PCSE system will work out whether the practice has had the correct amount deducted and any adjustments that are required and applied in the next contractual statement after your form has been fully processed and reconciled. That's sorting out that the practice has paid the correct amount. We've talked when we looked at the Type 2 form about the column that you complete what you truly had deducted from the practice so that you can see that difference column and you can speak to the practice about, oh, look, I've paid too much or I've not paid enough. How do I get this sorted between yourself and the practice? There is a little bit of a tricky situation whenever the practice, if you worked at a practice in 24-25 and they no longer have a contract, it's a little bit of a rare scenario, but it does pop up, and there is complexity in that, and it is a little bit delayed in getting that resolved at the moment. We are in the process of getting a detailed kind of handling instruction for that, so we should be able to proceed with those for the 24-25 forms, which is good news. So in the next slide, we get into under or overpayments if it's solo work. And this is where it really does depend, unfortunately, on the type of solo work that you've done, who you've worked for, what happens if. So although we've said, oh, okay, your record on PCSE Online matches what the solo provider has paid over for you, it might be that when you get to the end of the year, you establish that the tier rate that you should have been getting deducted at should have been higher because you've actually crept into a higher bracket than you were expecting, or vice versa, it could be lower. And this is where this under or overpayment scenario comes in. If it's out of hours work, then the rule is that PCSE needs to process a refund to the provider, and then they sort that out with you if it's been overpaid. If it's been underpaid, the rule is that PCSE need to request payment from the out-of-hours provider, and again, they need to then sort that out with yourself as GP. The rule's slightly different if you've been an ICB clinical leader board member. So PCSE would notify the ICB if there's a refund required to you, and the ICB will arrange that refund and liaise with you to how that's sorted out, whether that's an adjustment in payroll, etc. PCSE will then update your record. If it's an ICB clinical leader board member and the contributions have been underpaid, then PCSE notify that there's a shortfall to be sorted out, get your record up to date, but it's the ICB that will arrange the collection of the shortfall. And then if you've been an appraiser for an NHS England region and you're a type 2 GP, so that will have been, your pension contributions will have been collected through Solo, then the rule is slightly different, or it is different. PCSE are permitted to process the refund to be paid direct to the GP, because that is going through NHS England rather than ICBs, and that's who you've worked for. And if you've underpaid your contributions for solo appraisal work, then PCSE will request you to pay the shortfall payment, and then once that's been received, your record can then be updated. So bit of detail there, not relevant to you if you don't do any solo work. If you do solo work, then the important thing is what type of solo work or what kind of organisation is that I've worked for, and then have I got a shortfall or overpayment to get resolved. If I haven't, happy days. If you have, then the detail is relevant. So from a locum point of view, it's you yourself who's made these contributions. Again, if it turns out you should have paid at a higher tier rate, then we talked about the shortfall payment that you would need to make, and PCSE will process an adjustment so that your record's then updated and the type 2 form can be processed. Or if the GP has overpaid, then it will be refunded direct to you. The process for refunds, just to point out, if it's refunds direct to the GPs, has changed fairly recently. So if you've been through this scenario in the past, it might be that it probably would be that if you were notified of an overpayment, you would have received a cheque from NHS England. It now all goes through BACS. So you will receive a request of where to log your bank account details, and then those bank account details are what the payments team use to actually raise the refund request. So don't be alarmed if you do receive that, and it is a secure area in PCSE Online that you go in and log those details. You're not being asked to give them over the phone or to provide them by email or anything like that. So there's an area within the locum section of PCSE Online. You might have noticed it, locum bank details, I think it might be called. And so you'll be notified if we need your bank details to request a refund to be paid to you. Okay, so shall we jump back to questions, do you think, Debbie? Conant from our pensions team and Janet from NHS England have been kindly beavering away answering a lot of questions for us. I can see one here that's a bit about not being able to complete the form online. Nothing appears in the financial year drop-down box. What I would say the first thing to check there is, have you checked your employee contribution statement to make sure that contributions have been actually deducted for you for the year? And going back to those earlier points that we made about, if this is a salaried role that you have the contributions been deducted and showing on the employee contribution statement? If they have, then please contact us with a query to our customer service centre. But if they haven't, then that's where you need to go back to what's the cause of that. Did you as the GP notify that you've joined the practice? And if you've got that notified and approved in your performer record, it's speaking to the practice about they haven't completed the joiner, and that's why the system isn't expecting the type 2 form for you, because we haven't had any type 2 contributions as yet. So that's the most common reason. But if you do need support, then please contact us to let us know. We have, in March 25, no contributions deducted by mistake, and then it looks like the practice have then had a catch-up payment in May. So this would be impacting, so May would be into 25-26, 24-25 is showing an underpayment. So essentially, from the practice's point of view, I'm not quite sure how they would have managed to do that, but the scenario is the scenario. So if when your 24-25 is reconciled, anything that's missing that the practice should have had deducted for 24-25 will be deducted as an adjustment. 25-26, if there's then an overpayment when that year is ready for completion and reconciliation, then it would be refunded. So one will just offset the other. Question about the added years rate I need to put on the form is still very unclear. So if you have an added years contract, then you will, somewhere in your personal records at home, have a copy from NHS Pensions of the contract confirmation, which will say it starts on such and such a date, it ends on such and such a date, and the percentage to be deducted is this. So that's one way that you can check that. If you've got that record, you can contact NHS Pensions employee member helpline, if you do need any information from them. But what I would say to you is when you go to that type 2 form, if you think back to what I was doing there, completing the personal details tab, as soon as I ticked that I had an added years contract, it auto-populated with a percentage of the contract. So that's the percentage that you would then use against your pensionable pay to see what the total added years that should have been paid. So the percentage rate, would be populated on that first page of the type 2 form as soon as you tick that you had an added years contract. You saw in the demo that because our test GP did have an added years contract, and I kind of tried to proceed by saying that they didn't, by not ticking that they did, double negative, but then the system throws an error message and it doesn't let me proceed. So the system will tell you what the percentage is that we've got on record. If for any reason that's not what you're expecting to see, then submit a query to us. But if assuming that's correct, which it should be, then you would use that percentage against your total pensionable pay to say this is the amount of added years that I should have had or that I should have paid. So hopefully that helps.
One that I can see here says the last record in my PCSE portal shows the financial year 22-23. Am I up to date in my self-assessment form?
Okay, so let's just think about that. So the last approved, I think it's saying that if we go to the listing screen, the last approved form is 22-23. I think that's what we're saying. At the moment, if the GP had pensionable income continuously from that point, say, then they should also have 23-24 updated and approved, because what we're talking about completing now and what's available to complete now is 24-25. So we did say earlier that this time last year, 23-24 wasn't available for submission on PCSE online on type 2. It became available later in the year, but the advice was to submit a paper form if you wanted to make the 28th of February deadline. So to the GP who submitted that question, I guess the question is, did you submit a paper form? If you did, you would have had a case reference and some response back on that, explaining if it couldn't be processed because it was a query. But if you didn't submit the paper form, that's fine now. Just when you go to submit your 24-25, complete 23-24 first, just complete it and submit it, and then go straight on to 24-25, complete that and submit it, and the pensions team will pick up both forms and get them processed for you. I hope that's clear enough.
Thank you. So we've got a question around annualisation. So someone's asked, do we need to put the annualised salary anywhere or just a tier rate? And do they need to state that they've used the annualisation calculator?
That's a really good question. So first of all, it's just the tier rate for the form. The annualisation evidence, if you like, is there just for you to calculate that. But it is very helpful for you to submit, if you've had to complete the annualisation calculator because of your circumstances, it's very helpful for you to retain a copy of that. And when you submit a type 2 form, there currently isn't any notes page for you to add any notes to that. But that's one of the improvements that we'll be looking at going forward. So for the moment, it's just a case of please do keep a copy of that at hand. And if there is any query from PCSE in relation to the annualisation, then you'll have that to submit straight away. But as long as you've used the calculator for the correct year, then it should be fine. But there's nowhere to record what the annualised income is either. It's just, this is my, this is the tier rate that I've used. There's a question about, again, fairly niche scenario, somebody who was partner in Scotland for half the year and then became a salaried doctor in England. So the Type 2 form is just for the England pension scheme. As you've pointed out, didn't need to do a salaried GPs don't need to do a Type 2 in the Scottish pension scheme. But the only form that PCSE will require from you is the Type 2 form that applies for the period that you started working in England, and you follow whatever the rule is in Scotland for what you needed to do for your Scottish role. And question, actually, I haven't mentioned really anything, Debbie, about the total reward statement, or more accurately for GPs, the annual benefits statement. So I can see a few questions about that, so it's probably worthwhile just touching on that a little bit. So when we at PCSE have been able to successfully reconcile your Type 2 form, and that will then show as approved on PCSE Online, what we do is check your pensions online record, and we look to see whether that's right up to date. So we've just talked about actually that it should be showing as up to date to 23-24 if everything for all of the previous years all the certificates for previous years have been successfully reconciled and there are no gaps in your record. So if it's showing us up to date to 23-24, we're able to add the contributions for 24-25 into your pensions online record. And if you've had your Type 2 form submitted by the 28th of February deadline, you can expect then to see in the summer refresh of the statements from NHS Pensions, you can expect to see your annual benefit statement be updated to include 24-25. So that's the happiest path situation, and that's the situation we want everybody to be in. Now, we do know that there are gaps in some GP records. So if you had a difficult year or a year that there was a problem reconciling and you were going to kind of go back to it and it's still outstanding, so then because the NHS pensions online system can only be updated in sequential year order, even if when you go to that listing screen, that's why it's important to go and have a look at that and check it. So even if all of the years from 1920 onwards are all showing there as approved, all the way up to 23-24, now you're doing your 24-25. If you had a gap in 18-19 where either the form didn't get submitted, or as I say, it got submitted, there was a query about reconciliation and it never got resolved, because that wasn't then able to be updated into the pension system that year, that creates a gap in your record. And because of the limitations of the POL system, PCSE are unable to then key any updates after that until the gap year gets resolved. So in last year's cycle, if you had a gap in your record, then we would have written to you if you submitted your 23-24 form and said, we've updated, we've processed your form, hopefully everything was fine with it, but actually we can't update pensions online because you've got a gap. Please submit the certificate for the gap here again, and then we can look at getting that resolved. So appreciate some people have got quite complex historic records, and getting the gaps resolved can be certainly tedious and a little bit difficult, but we have got a team that are focused on supporting GPs to resolve historic years and get gaps in records kind of resolved, I guess, and sorted, and then all the subsequent years added on to that. In fact, Con is a very key member of that team who's here with us this evening. So we would urge you to, if you haven't submitted the forms, and even if you did submit them a few years back and had a reply about a difficult query, or a query even that you didn't understand at the time, let's get you back engaged on that year again. We'll go through it with you, we'll get it sorted, resolve the gap, get everything up to date, and then each year thereafter that you're submitting your Type 2 forms, it just becomes straightforward. But it's a really important point that you'll only get a refresh of your annual benefit statement if there are no gaps in your record. So we want to work with you to get the gaps resolved. So there are a couple of questions about various versions of approved leave, so maternity leave and so on. And for those that maybe weren't here a bit earlier on in the session, I did say that we will be publishing a bit of a kind of guide on some not annualization, approved leave scenarios and the completion of the form, but what the ins and outs of that are, because we do have quite a lot of questions on that, and the rule did change from October 2022, so certainly 23-24 onwards. The tier rate is now calculated based on your actual earnings when you were on approved leave if you had reduced pay. Don't forget, there's a lot of people who have periods of approved leave, but it might be that they don't have reduced pay, so it doesn't really impact anything. You still have to say that you have approved leave when you complete the form because it's a statement of fact, but it doesn't impact on any of the calculations. But if you've had reduced pay during a period of approved leave, your tier rate for 24-25 would be calculated based on your actual earnings, so the reduced earnings. Employer contributions are on what the earnings would be if you hadn't been on approved leave. So that changed, and that's why we think, there is guidance that explains it on the NHS Pensions website, but just in terms of the impact on the completion of the Type 2 forms for GPs, we're just going to try and do something that makes that a little bit clearer. But for the people that's relevant to, then look out for that in the coming weeks. We'll certainly aiming to have that done by the start of February to give you plenty of time to get your Type 2 done before the end of February. So I think we have covered most of the topics that there've been questions on. So I'm just going to hand back to you to wrap us up. Thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Katrina, and thanks to you for going through the demonstration of PCSE online in so much detail. Hope that was really helpful for everybody. Now, as Katrina mentioned through the session, we do have a lot of other supporting information available on the PCSE website. So we've got user guides, we've got a frequently asked questions area, and lots of other information available. And we also have lots of supporting videos on the PCSE YouTube channel that can help you with other areas, such as updating your performer record and things like that. So please do have a look at that if you need some support in those other areas. Thank you for joining us this evening, and I'd just like to say thank you to all the colleagues that have been supporting, answering all the questions in the background as well. And thank you to Katrina for presenting.